So welcome everyone to this workshop on science news literacy. Science news literacy, how to fact check the sound bites and understand the truth behind the story. I'm Diana Sachs. I am the Health and Human Services Librarian here at WMU. I'm joined by my colleague, Carrie Leatherman, who is now back with us.
Hello.
Carrie is our Natural Sciences Librarian. So I'm going to keep sharing my screen throughout this presentation. Carrie, when we reach the slides that you will be speaking to, just let me know and I will advance through the slides.
Sounds great. Thanks, Diana.
For our student attendees, again, if you are receiving credit or extra credit for any of your courses for attending this workshop, please make sure to put your name, your professor's name, and your course in the chat box. We will make sure that you get credit for attending today. So for this workshop today, we're going to discuss several different types of what we might refer to as fake news. We will also talk about how science is conducted and reported on by different news organizations and other kinds of organizations. And we will talk about how that reporting impacts the way in which we as citizens can responsibly consume science information and then use that information to make good decisions, whether for ourselves or for our communities. We will finish up the workshop with a short activity where you can put some of what we talk about into practice. We have put a link to a resource guide on this page, and we'll provide you with this link in the chat, and we'll provide you with this link again at the end of the presentation. So the various resources that we talk about today will all be linked on this resource guide, so you can refer back to that at any time later on. So I want to start out with this story from the Washington Post from 2016, which reported on a research study that was done. It was a joint effort between computer scientists at Columbia University and the French National Institute. And this research study found that 59% of links shared on social media had never been clicked on before they were shared. So that means most people are sharing links without reading the content behind them. So does that number surprise you? I mean, have you ever shared a link without clicking on it and reading it, visiting the site first? I will admit that I have occasionally done it, although I've learned my lesson and I try not to do that anymore. Now, let's start by clarifying a few terms. Some of the different things that we often lump together under the category of fake news. The first is misinformation. Misinformation is the unintentional spreading of false information, usually due to ignorance or confusion. And that can happen when, for example, we don't read the full article before we share the link on social media. This is something that everybody does. Everybody has been guilty of accidentally sharing misinformation. And we often do it with good intentions. We think that we're sharing something interesting or fun or useful. We don't know that the information we're sharing isn't true, or maybe is only partially true, or is subject to being misinterpreted or misunderstood. Now, the next type of so-called fake news is disinformation. Now, disinformation is knowingly, intentionally sharing false information. That's basically knowingly lying. Next up is propaganda. Propaganda is a type of disinformation or intentional lies about information, but on a large and systemic scale. Now, another one to watch out for is nihilation. Now, nihilation is a very specific type of disinformation, which denies the reality or the very existence of the phenomenon in question. So, for example, following the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, which left 26 people dead, most of them little kids, there were conspiracy theorists who were promoting the idea that those children never even existed, that the entire story was made up, that the grieving parents were just actors. So that's not just lying about the facts of the situation, it's denying that the situation even exists. So misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, annihilation, types of fake news. Opinion, on the other hand, I have opinion separated out on this slide because opinion, as long as it is clearly stated as opinion, is not fake news. But when we treat opinion as though it were fact, that can lead to spreading misinformation. The most important thing for all of us is to be able to recognize when we encounter these different types of so-called fake news so that we can be prepared to do our part to stop its spread. So next, I'm going to play a quick video called Science in America. And I'm going to change my screen sharing settings. So bear with me one moment while I set this up. All right, so now I'm going to play this quick video. And this video will talk about the importance of science for all of us in our society and how a good understanding of science can help us make good decisions, whether, again, as individuals or part of our larger society.
How did America rise up from a backwoods country to be one of the greatest nations the world has ever known? We pioneered industries. And all of this required the greatest innovations in science and technology in the world. And so science is a fundamental part of the country that we are. But in this, the 21st century, when it comes time to make decisions about science, it seems to me people have lost the ability to judge what is true and what is not, what is reliable, what is not reliable, what should you believe, what should you not believe. And when you have people who don't know much about science, standing in denial of it and rising to power, that is a recipe for the complete dismantling of our informed democracy.
Let us demand that educators around America teach evolution not as fact, but as theory.
Increasing number of parents showing skepticism about vaccinations.
Voters have approved a ban on GMOs.
Call climate change unproven science.
That's not the country I remember growing up in. Not that we didn't have challenges. I'm old enough to remember the 60s and the 70s. And a hot war and a cold war, civil rights movement, and all of this was going on. But I don't remember any time where people were standing in denial of what science was. One of the great things about science is that it is an entire exercise in finding what is true. You have a hypothesis, you test it, I get a result. A rival of mine double checks it because they think I might be wrong. They perform an even better experiment than I did and they find out, hey, this experiment matches. Oh my gosh, we're onto something here. And out of this rises a new emergent truth. It does it better than anything else we have ever come up with as human beings. This is science. It's not something to toy with. It's not something to say, I choose not to believe equals MC squared. You don't have that option. When you have an established scientific emergent truth, it is true whether or not you believe in it. And the sooner you understand that, the faster we can get on with the political conversations about how to solve the problems that face us. So once you understand that humans are warming the planet, you can then have a political conversation about that. You can say, well, are there carbon credits? Do we do this? Do we put a tariff on it? Do we fund? Do we subsidize? Those have political answers. And every minute one is in denial, you are delaying the political solution that should have been established years ago. As a voter, as a citizen, scientific issues will come before you. And isn't it worth it to say, all right, let me at least become scientifically literate so that I can think about these issues and act intelligently upon them? Recognize what science is and allow it to be what it can and should be in the service of civilization. It's in our hands.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to sharing in the slides again, and I will pass things off to Carrie, who will talk a little bit more about what Dr. Tyson was just speaking about.
Okay. Okay, next slide, Diana. Okay, hi everybody. Yes, that was a very compelling video by Dr. Tyson. Wow. All right, so let's talk about science, some of that basic science literacy that Dr. Tyson was talking about. I have a few science vocabulary words, terminology that I think it's important to kind of lay out there before we talk about anything else related to science news, fake news, just so we're all on the same page. So let's go ahead and start. The first one is theory, tested, confirmed, explanation. Theory came up kind of tangentially in that video a moment ago of former Vice President Pence talking about evolution. Evolution, scientifically speaking, is a theory, so is gravity. In science, theory is something that has been confirmed. The layman's term of theory, common usage of the word theory, kind of implies that it's something uncertain or at best a guess. This is not the case in science. Theories are proven. That's just the term that's used. So having said that, let's go on. Hypothesis, a suggested explanation for an event. A hypothesis, again, it's testable. It's not a random guess. It's based on scientists' general understanding of a scientific principle, but still needs to be proven. We'll talk about hypotheses and a couple of definitions when we talk about scientific method. Data, information that is especially when it's to be analyzed or used for the basis of a decision. Data is something that's gathered when scientific experiments are done. The scientific method of research with defined steps. Those steps include, making an observation, form a hypothesis about the observation, conduct an experiment, collect data, compare your experimental results with the hypothesis, and then draw conclusions. Science is done via the scientific method. It's a huge component of it, and it's good to keep in mind that that's something that is done in science. On to our next page, peer review. This is a process by which one or more experts go ahead and read a manuscript that's been submitted for publication in a scholarly journal. The goal of this is for peers, other scientists that have a similar level of understanding or expertise in a particular topic that the original author who's submitting an article did an experiment with and is submitting their research conclusions about, have those peers actually review to make sure that the scientific experiment was set up well, that it's statistically valid in how they've analyzed their data, that the author or researcher that did the experiment made reasonable conclusions based on what the experiment found, based on the data gathered. The goal is to make sure that science is done well, and we have people publishing and talking about their research that's been done in a reasonable way. It's kind of just a little standard that people need to reach in order to publish their findings. Scholarly communication is a process by which the results of research are shared among researchers. This can happen in conference proceedings, articles being published in scholarly journals. This is basically the way that the scientific community shares their research findings and then discusses these research findings amongst themselves by, conferences, reading articles and publications, and making sure that the conclusions from all these individual studies are adding up to a larger context in their discipline that makes sense based on what they found in their experiments. Overall, scholarly communication helps us find the greater truth that Dr. Tyson was talking about. It also means, though, that one study alone does not determine what is seen as factual. I don't know if you can see my air quotes, but scholarly communication is a process by which this happens. Next slide. And two terms that are really important, especially when we're talking about science news, the idea of correlation and causation. Basically what these mean is if there are two variables, so two events that are happening, if they're happening in relationship to each other or at the same time, what have you, they're often seen as correlated. There's a statistical tests that you can do to determine if two events, happenings, what have you, variables are correlated or not, which is fabulous. The catch, though, is even if you determine two things are correlated, there isn't necessarily a cause and effect given. So, for example, it's pretty well known, I guess, that crickets chirp faster when there's a higher outside temperature. Okay. A lot of studies have been done to show that there's that correlation. There's so much evidence supporting that it's basically a given that, when there's a higher temperature, crickets are going to chirp faster. But, and if you can see in the illustration on this slide, even though there's such a strong correlation between these and other research, backing up that this is a cause and effect, it's still oftentimes referred to as a correlation even in the scientific literature. And you'll find that overall that it's very rare for a science paper to state this causes that. They usually talk about how strongly they correlate with each other for a lot of reasons, but there's a real difference between correlation and causation. Correlation does not mean something is being caused by another thing. Important to keep in mind. Okay, next slide. Okay, and to kind of a humorous example of this idea of correlation and causation, there is a site out there, a website, that basically puts together these types of correlations and spurious causation, and the site is actually called Spurious Correlation. You can see here one of their examples is the idea that the per capita cheese consumption per year in the US very strongly correlates with the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. I'm just going to pause for effect there. Now, statistically, when you run the numbers, these really correlate strongly. I got to be honest with you, I really don't think one causes the other. I don't think you would find anybody that claims that. But this example illustrates that even when something correlates, it doesn't necessarily imply causation. You got to really look into the experiment or whatever observations have been made to determine if there is causation. That's what science is about. Having said that, feel safe in your bed tonight. Eat cheese. You're probably going to be fine. But remember, correlation does not necessarily mean causation. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we've covered those basic definitions. Let's kind of dip our toe into the idea of science journalism, and especially how journalism interprets science. The cartoon up on the screen here is kind of a funny example, but very true example in a lot of ways of the science news cycle. And it starts with, up at the top, you can see someone sitting at their laptop typing away, and the little thought bubble there says that the scientist is writing an article about how they concluded that A, some factor A, is correlated with B, assuming that C, D, and E happened at the same time. A through E could be anything. One example could be that coffee drinkers, A, have fewer heart attacks, B, and people that also exercise, eat healthy, have no underlying heart disease, which could be factors C, D, and E. Totally hypothetical example. Don't run out and start drinking lots of coffee if you feel weak in the heart, please. We're not making that assumption. This is just kind of a random example. But in this cartoon, the cycle moves on then from that researcher. It moves on to the university where that researcher works, issuing a press release saying that A causes B. Pretty soon stories are running, in other news publications, websites, newspapers, cable news channels, touting how A causes B, and it eventually starts to evolve into a situation where they say if A is happening, you better start doing A so you don't have B to start happening. And at the very end, up kind of in the upper left corner of the cartoon, you see, the researcher's sweet grandma wearing a tinfoil hat, and she's, wearing this because she's afraid of B, so she's trying to guard against A with her tinfoil hat, and it's really kind of sweet. It's a funny cartoon, but it kind of emphasizes that it's really easy for scientific findings that are published to be generalized, to be overgeneralized perhaps in some cases. And for people to draw conclusions or making broad generalizations about coffee drinking, heart disease, COVID, all kinds of other things that aren't necessarily pointed to in the original scientific study. So something to keep in mind. Avoid overgeneralization. Look for overgeneralization in news stories. Okay, so having said that, I'm going to turn this back over to Diana. Take it away, Diana.
Thank you. So as Carrie described, the science news cycle, the way that information goes from an original research experiment to how almost like a game of telephone where it passes from one person to the next, to the next, to the next, all these different news sources before it actually gets to us as news consumers can lead to a lot of misunderstandings, and in some cases intentional disinformation like we were talking about earlier. So one of the ways that misinformation or the unintentional sharing of false or misleading information can spread is when information is taken out of context. And this is very common for us in science news when it can be very difficult to understand the true impact of something on our lives or on our society because we don't necessarily have all of the context. So for example, we've probably all seen a lot of graphs like this one up on the screen recently showing the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths in the United States. Now, some people are looking at these numbers and suggesting that the coronavirus is really just like the flu, or that the people who died would have died anyway of something else. And it's hard to know how much of that is true or not true without the larger context. So let's look at COVID-19 deaths in this larger context so that we can better understand these numbers that we're talking about. So here we can see the number of people in 2019, the year before COVID-19 pandemic started, who died of each of the leading causes in the United States. You'll see that for heart disease, we had almost 660,000 deaths. For cancers, we had just under 600,000 deaths. All the way down, we have influenza and pneumonia at just under 50,000 deaths for the year 2019. Now let's add in COVID-19. Comparing with, so as of yesterday, I took yesterday's numbers, I have not checked today, but as of yesterday, there were 419,341 COVID-19 deaths in the United States. Now, we don't have the full data yet for 2020 because we're only a few weeks into the new year, but we can still better understand that number of over 400,000 COVID-19 deaths by comparing it with the data for the previous year. And COVID-19 is on track to be the third leading cause of death in the United States. You can see it falls just under heart disease and cancer as the cause of death compared with the 2019 data. While all deaths that are caused by influenza or the flu or any kind of pneumonia are way down, much, much lower on this list. So in addition to our tendency to take information out of context, we're also subject to biases. And this is not something to fear. We have biases simply by being human. It's not something that, it's not something that's necessarily learned. These are inherent parts of how the human brain works, is to have natural biases. But by understanding these biases, we can ask ourselves questions as we encounter information so that we can challenge these biases that are inherent parts of our neurology. The first one to talk about are cognitive biases. This is a large category of unconscious tendencies of our brains to process information in a way that is biased, that's irrational. They're like shortcuts that our brains take in order to help us make sense of information more efficiently. And we all demonstrate these cognitive biases regardless of political belief or education level or anything. But once we're aware of the biases, we're better able to avoid falling into the traps that they place for us. One type of cognitive bias that I want to talk about today is called confirmation bias. And this is the tendency to process information that we encounter by looking for information and interpreting it in ways that are consistent with things that we already believe. And conversely, ignoring information or downplaying interpretations of that information that might challenge the things that we already believe. The next one is echo chambers. And echo chambers go beyond ourselves. These involve the people around us, our friends, neighbors, family. Echo chambers occur when we connect with people, whether in real life face-to-face or in social media, but we're connecting with people who are similar to ourselves. And that leads us to have fewer people in our chamber, our echo chamber, who challenge us, and more people who reinforce our existing beliefs. So it's kind of like that confirmation bias that I just mentioned, that we have fundamentally internal to our brains, but magnified by the group of people around us when we only interact with people who agree with us. The next one is filter bubbles. And filter bubbles happen as a result of our interaction with information online. Filter bubbles actually occur through algorithms. When internet searches and websites use those algorithms to build profiles about us, and then give us the information that they assume that we want. And these profiles are often based on what we've clicked on in the past, our search history, our location, various demographic features. But as a result, by building these profiles, the websites are more likely to only give us information that reinforces what we've already done in the past and what we already believe. And it becomes that much more difficult for us to come into contact with information that might have contradicting or different viewpoints. So all of these factors mean that we aren't very easily passively exposed to ideas that challenge our biases. And that in turn reinforces our biases. And that means that it's up to us to actively seek out points of view that challenge our biases in good faith, not, so that we really do consider those points of view that challenge us with an open mind. And that's especially important when we deal with complex information like science news. So as information consumers, there are some techniques that we can use to compensate for our biases, to spot so-called bad science, deal with science as being misrepresented, or that might have been poorly conducted in the first place, or poorly represented or described. So this infographic, which again is linked on our media literacy resource guide, which again, we'll put the link in the chat at the end of this presentation. This infographic is available to help you. And you can refer back to it. You can blow it up into big size on your own. I'm going to go over the main points real quick here. So first, watch out for clickbait headlines. Check to see if the news article is accurately reflecting what the original science researcher said, or if the article is distorting the science for a sensation. Check to see if the organization has a history of only publishing science news that supports a particular point of view. Now, Carrie's already talked about the difference between correlation and causation. So check to make sure that the news articles aren't confusing one for the other and saying that just because two things happen at the same time, it means that one causes the other. Does not mean that. So make sure they're not confusing correlation from causation. And also make sure that they're providing evidence for any conclusions that they reach. You'll want to think about the methodology behind the scientific research study. Did they include enough subjects in this study? Do those subjects represent the population as a whole? Did they use a control group? Did they use blind testing? And then check to see if the news organization cherry-picked data from the study, or are they reporting on research that can't be repeated or that hasn't gone through the peer review process. All of those factors can help you evaluate whether you can feel comfortable making decisions and sharing information based on what you're reading. And remember, you're not entirely on your own. It's useful to have a few reliable fact-checking resources in your pocket. Many of you are probably familiar with Snopes.com, which has investigated many claims in science news. Another tool to use is SciCheck, which is part of the factcheck.org nonprofit organization that focuses on science information. And again, the links to both of these organizations are on our media literacy resource guide. So now that we've talked about these various tools that you could use to critically evaluate science news, we're going to do an exercise to practice. This is the hands-on portion of this workshop. I'm going to put two links in the chat in a minute. The first link is going to take you to a news article from the Tennessean, which is a major newspaper based in Nashville, Tennessee. And the second link is going to take you to a shared Google Doc. So what I'd like you to do is first skim the article from the Tennessean. Think about how this article is presenting scientific research information about the volcanic activity at Yellowstone National Park. Then, after you've skimmed that article, do a really quick web search and see if you can find other sources that report on the same research. Once you find another source that reports on the same research of volcanic activity at Yellowstone, answer the questions on the shared document. So again, look for one hint that can help is to look for articles that were written around the same time and that refer to the same researchers. So I'm going to pop these links into, excuse me one second, just got to grab these links. Here's the link to the Tennessean article. And here is the link to the shared document. So take just about 5 minutes to review the article and then do your quick web search and answer the questions about what you discover. And let me know if you're having any trouble with either of these links, please. John, yes. So I just put the link to the article in the Tennessean newspaper. And so that's the article that you will skim. And once you've skimmed through that article, see if you can find some other article that you could find in a quick web search that reports on the same information or the same research, and then answer the questions in the activity. Let's take about 1 more minute. So it's fine if you don't complete. This is all about initial impressions. So we've got a couple of different articles that you've found, and some of you may have found others that you haven't had a chance to put up in the document, and that's totally fine. This is a practice exercise. But just with these couple that we have here, the difference in language is quite startling. In the Tennessean article, the title was Yellowstone Supervolcano May Blow Sooner Than Thought Could Wipe Out Life on the Planet. That's kind of frightening. The one from National Geographic is Yellowstone Supervolcano May Rumble to Life Faster Than Thought. Well, what is what we thought? What is faster? That goes back to how important it is to take information in context. When we say faster than thought, are they saying that it could destroy all life on the planet next week? Or are they saying that we previously thought that it might erupt in 10,000 years. Now we think it's more likely to erupt in 9,500 years. We need that context. And you've done a good job noticing that whether or not the authors of the article consulted the original science research study. If you can't tell whether or not they consulted the original research study, that's a red flag. It does not mean that they didn't, but it means you should look at that information more closely. So some good findings that you've discovered there. I'm going to go back to our slides here, and I'm going to turn things over to Carrie, who'll talk with you a little bit more about some of the suggestions for good sources of generally reliable science news.
Okay. Thank you, Diana. So reliable science journalism sources. There are a couple that I can recommend. I'm going to start off with two that are up on the top of the screen there. One put out by the journal Science and one put out by the journal Nature. Now, Science and Nature are two of the most highly regarded general science scholarly journals being published today. They are the best. They are very good. They have very high quality research published in them. Luckily for us too, they actually on their websites have a news page where you can go and see, brief news stories talking about some of the most current science discoveries and science news that's happening nowadays. Very good sources. The next one is Science News, and this one, it's not put out by the journal Science. This is actually put out by the organization Society for Science, a nonprofit that's dedicated to expanding scientific literacy, STEM education, science research. It's a news site, exclusively news site. They're not publishing original research like other areas of the science and the Nature websites are. But it's very highly regarded, and it was founded in the early 20th century with the goal of increasing the quality of science journalism. Very good site, good to check out. Two other sources that are good are the two newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post. Both of these papers have very high quality journalism standards, very good editorial policies. They also have reporters that are dedicated to reporting science news, and they have science news sections in them. Very good coverage, very reliable. One thing I should point out for all 5 of these sources is that unlike many science news websites that are completely free, these have limited free parts to them. New York Times, Washington Post, I think in general for those newspapers, unless you subscribe, you will only get, say, 3 clicks per month that you can look at news stories. For science and nature news websites, or web pages, excuse me, they often post like the latest or today's science news for free, but to access back stories, you would have to be a subscriber to those journals. And with science news, they're a little bit more open with their accessibility. You can access probably, let's say, like about the past year of science news stories, but for much older articles, you would have to be a subscriber. The good news is, as a student through WMU libraries, you have access to all of these publications. Kind of the not so good news is once you graduate, you wouldn't necessarily be able to access all of the material that you would as a student, unless you subscribe. And this isn't something we've talked about, but I want to put a pitch out there for oftentimes the quality of a news source, especially science news, it's, you get what you pay for. That could be a whole other workshop, but it's important to remember. Also at the bottom of this slide, I did include SciCheck again, because you can never check your news sources too often. It's a good pitch for if you have any questions about a news source that you're finding on other sites, by all means, check it out. That spotting bad science infographic Dinah talked about, it's important. All of these 5 news sources that I just talked about are doing those exact same things. They're looking for bad science. They're posting reliable stuff. It's important to keep in mind. And next slide, please, Diana. Why that's important to keep in mind. You see 2 web screenshots there. The one on the left is it's just so awful. I'm not even going to let you see the whole thing. It's got that red X through it because it's produced by the American Council of Science and Health. Sounds very official, has a very official looking website. Comparing that with a screenshot on the right of Nature, talking about science journalism and some ranking lists that have been published. The American Council of Science and Health published a news story back in 2017, ranking a lot of media coverage of science, cable news channels, newspapers, magazines, popular websites. That isn't necessarily a bad thing in itself, but this organization, American Council of Science and Health, is an unreliable source. A lot of the points we covered in that spotting bad science, they don't do. It's a kind of an organization that really promotes industry interests in science and environmental issues. It's just not good. They don't fact check. They kind of cherry pick what news stories fit with their own personal or institutional viewpoint. They're just not good. They're really not good. The webpage on the right, Nature, that Nature story, is kind of taking this particular organization to task on that news story. One of the takeaways is, again, you gotta check these news stories coming out. What for me too, as a science librarian, is actually quite chilling is, even though some news sites, science news sites, are honestly notorious for being bad news outlets, they're still out there. Think about that. Even though many people widely regard that site on the left as being quite bad, it's still out there putting out news. Yikes. So be a good consumer, look for bad science, be aware of it. Just remember, as a consumer of news stories, of science news stories, you have tools that you can use to actually help you spot bad science news from good science news. All right. That's all I have on that slide. Any questions?
I'll just jump in and say again, if you need credit for attending this workshop, please make sure to put your name, your email address, and your professor's name and course in the chat so that we can contact your professor and give you credit for attending. And yes, any questions?
Recording of the presentation. Yes, we will record a presentation, or we will post the recording. We will post it probably in a couple of days once we're able to process it on our end. It'll be on the WMU Libraries YouTube channel. If you just Google WMU Libraries YouTube, it'll pop on up and you'll be able to have access to it there.
And we've also, I put a link in chat. We would love your feedback on this workshop. So please, we'd appreciate it if you would go ahead and complete that quick survey. It's short, but it gives us valuable information about what your thoughts are on this program. And then lastly, I'm going to put in a link to the guide, the resource guide that we've been referring to. So again, if you would like to refer back to any of the resources we've discussed today, they are all linked on this resource guide.
Yeah. And not to throw too many links at you, I'm actually going to put my email address in chat. If you guys have questions about anything we covered in this presentation, and honestly, just, if you have science research questions, go for it. It's what we're here for.
And me too, please.
Oh yeah, I'll put you in there too, Diana. So Carrie Leatherman and Diana Sachs. We are health and science librarians. We are here to answer your questions. We like it.
It's literally our job to help you with your research questions.
Yeah, so keep us in mind. We are a resource for you all.
I'm going to stop the recording. So if anybody has a question that they would like to ask,